Imagine you are the most powerful man in the world. Your word commands armies. Your signature raises kingdoms. 100 princes kneel when you enter a room. You have inherited an empire so vast that men call it holy, Roman, and imperial all at once. 3 words that each carry the weight of history. Emperors before you stretched their dominion from the cold shores of the North Sea to the sun-scorched plains of southern Italy. They broke barbarian kingdoms. They crushed rebellions with iron fists. They built cathedrals that pierced the clouds. And yet, on a January morning in the year 1077, the most powerful man in Europe stood barefoot in the snow. Not on a battlefield. Not chained in a dungeon. He stood voluntarily in a castle courtyard in northern Italy, wearing the rough wool of a penitent, with no crown on his head and no sword at his side. He had been standing there for 3 days. Fasting. Weeping. Begging. He was Henry IV, Holy Roman Emperor. The man he was begging? He held no army. He commanded no cavalry. He had no treasury of gold, no fleet of ships, no wall of spearmen at his back. He was a pope. His name was Gregory VII, and he had just done something no sword, no siege engine, no cavalry charge had ever managed to do. He had brought an emperor to his knees using nothing but words, theology, and the terrifying, invisible force of spiritual authority. This is the story of the one power that toppled emperors faster than any army. This is the story of the medieval papacy. The world before the popes ruled. To understand how a pope could make an emperor weep in the snow, we have to go back, far back, to a world where Christianity was still young, still fragile, still trying to find its feet among the ruins of Rome. In the year 476, something extraordinary happened in the Western world. The last Roman emperor of the West, a young, almost pitifully named boy called Romulus Augustulus, was quietly deposed by a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer. No great battle. No dramatic last stand on the Palatine Hill. The empire simply stopped. Centuries of Roman civilization, the roads, the aqueducts, the legal codes, the sheer gravitational authority of Rome did not vanish overnight. But the political structure that had held the Western world together dissolved like salt in rain. What remained? The Church. When Rome fell, the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, did not fall with it. In fact, as secular power collapsed around him, the papacy began to absorb something remarkable: legitimacy. People who no longer had an emperor to look to began looking to the Church. Who else could read? Who else kept records? Who else maintained schools, hospitals, and charitable networks across a fractured continent? The answer, almost entirely, was the clergy. This was not a deliberate power grab, at least not at first. It was simply the logic of collapse. When institutions fail, whatever institution survives becomes indispensable. And the Church not only survived, it thrived. But here is where the story gets complicated. Because the Church did not exist in a political vacuum. The men who became bishops, archbishops, abbots, and eventually popes, these men needed land to feed their communities. They needed protection from raiders, warlords, and ambitious local nobles. They needed secular power to do their sacred work. And secular power, in turn, needed the Church. A king in the early medieval world could not simply declare himself king and expect people to obey. He needed divine sanction. He needed the Church to say, publicly, ritually, and with all the theological weight of salvation and damnation behind it, that God approved of his rule. This created the most consequential entanglement in Western history, the symbiotic, deeply unstable marriage between the Church and the Crown. For a time, both sides were content with this arrangement. The king protected church lands. The Church crowned the king. Both grew powerful together. But there was a question lurking at the center of this arrangement. A question that neither side wanted to answer too directly, because the answer would inevitably make one of them subordinate to the other. Who exactly was in charge? The rising tide. How the papacy built its power. Let's meet the Church in its early medieval form, because this is an institution that spent several centuries doing something almost no human organization has ever successfully done. It built a theory of power so compelling, so emotionally resonant, so cosmically framed that people accepted it as simply the way the universe worked. The theory went something like this. There are two realms of authority in this world. There is the temporal realm, the world of kings, armies, taxes, laws, and earthly justice. And there is the spiritual realm, the world of souls, salvation, sin, and eternity. Now, which realm matters more? To any medieval Christian, and virtually everyone in Western Europe during this period was, at least nominally, a medieval Christian, the answer was obvious. What happens to your body in this life is temporary. What happens to your soul in the next life is eternal. Therefore, the authority that governs the eternal realm is, by logical necessity, superior to the authority that governs the temporary one. And who governed the eternal realm? The Church. This was not a subtle argument. It was sledgehammer theology. And once you accepted the basic premise, which most people did, because the alternative was to doubt Christianity itself, the political implications were enormous. If the Pope had authority over the spiritual realm, and if the spiritual realm was superior to the temporal realm, then the Pope had a legitimate claim to supervise kings. Not just in religious matters, but in any matter that touched the soul, which, in medieval theology, was essentially every matter. This was the intellectual architecture of papal supremacy, and it was constructed over centuries by some of the most brilliant minds of the early medieval world. One of the most influential was a man named Gelasius I, who served as pope at the very end of the 5th century, right after Rome fell. Gelasius articulated what historians now call the doctrine of the two swords, the idea that God had given humanity two kinds of authority, priestly and royal, and that the priestly was the more important of the two. But Gelasius was careful. He didn't say the Pope should rule kingdoms. He said the Pope should guide kings in spiritual matters, and that kings should defer to priests when it came to questions of religion. On paper, this sounds reasonable. In practice, it was a powder keg, because in medieval Europe, almost everything was a question of religion. Now, while the papacy was building its intellectual foundations, something equally significant was happening in the secular world. In 800 AD, on Christmas Day, in the Basilica of St. Peter in Rome, a Frankish king named Charles knelt before Pope Leo III, and Leo placed a crown on his head. Carolus Magnus, Charles the Great, Charlemagne. The symbolism of that moment cannot be overstated. Here was the most powerful king in Western Europe, a man who had conquered the Saxons, the Lombards, the Avars, and a dozen other peoples, receiving his imperial title from the hands of a priest. What did that mean? It meant, in the most public and theatrical way imaginable, that imperial authority flowed through the Church. That a king became an emperor not simply by conquest or inheritance, but by papal coronation. Now, Charlemagne himself would probably have disputed this interpretation. He was a deeply pious Christian, but he also understood power, and he would not have seen himself as subordinate to the Pope. He likely understood the coronation as a mutual recognition, the Pope legitimizing his authority, not bestowing it. But the ceremony had been performed. The precedent had been set. And precedents in medieval Europe had a way of becoming permanent. The machinery of spiritual power, how the Church actually controlled people. Before we go further, we need to understand something crucial. The papacy's power was not just theoretical. It was practical, immediate, and deeply personal in ways that could terrify even the bravest warrior. The medieval Church had weapons. Not swords, something worse. The first weapon was excommunication. To be excommunicated meant to be cast out of the body of the Church, cut off from the sacraments, from the community of the faithful, from the spiritual lifeline that medieval Christians believed connected them to God and to salvation. No confession, no communion, no last rites. For a medieval person, this was not merely an embarrassment. It was a death sentence for the soul. It meant that if you died while excommunicated, you would not be buried in consecrated ground. You would go to hell. And it was not just the individual who suffered. If your neighbors or subordinates believed you were under divine condemnation, they became deeply uneasy associating with you. Trade dried up. Alliances frayed. Vassals began wondering whether their oaths to you were still binding. Excommunication was social, economic, and political poison. wrapped in a theological package. The second weapon was interdict. An interdict was excommunication on a geographic scale. If a pope placed a city, a region, or an entire kingdom under interdict, all public religious services ceased. No masses, no baptisms, no marriages, no last rites. Churches locked their doors. Bells fell silent. Imagine what that felt like in a deeply religious medieval society. Your children couldn't be baptized. Your parents couldn't receive last rites. Your dead couldn't be buried in holy ground. The entire spiritual infrastructure of daily life, which was also the emotional and psychological infrastructure, simply stopped. An interdict didn't just punish a king. It punished everyone under that king's rule. And when the people suffer because of their king's quarrel with the Pope, the people begin to ask a very uncomfortable question. Why are we suffering for this man? Which brings us to the third weapon, and perhaps the most dramatic one: deposition. A pope could, in theory, declare that a king or emperor was no longer the legitimate ruler of his kingdom. He could release that ruler's subjects from their oaths of allegiance. He could invite other princes to take the throne. This sounds almost absurdly ambitious. But it worked, repeatedly, because of the deep, sincere belief among medieval people that the Pope was the vicar of Christ on earth. If Christ's representative on earth said your king was illegitimate, a very large number of people would believe it. And a king without the loyalty of his people, his nobles, and his church is just a man with a crown he can no longer wear safely. The investiture controversy, the earthquake that changed everything. Now we reach the great crisis. The moment when all these tensions, 2 centuries of slowly accumulating, finally exploded into open conflict. The year is 1073. A monk named Hildebrand has just become Pope Gregory VII. Gregory is not a large man. He is not a soldier. He grew up in relative obscurity, entering monastic life as a young man and rising through the church's administrative ranks through sheer force of intelligence, discipline, and ideological conviction. But Gregory VII carries within him a vision of the church so radical, so comprehensive, so uncompromising that it will reshape Western civilization. Gregory believed, with absolute burning certainty, that the church must be free. Free from secular interference. Free from the corruption of kings who treated church offices as political prizes. Free to govern itself according to divine law rather than royal convenience. And the central battleground for this freedom was a practice called lay investiture. Here is how it worked. In medieval Europe, when a new bishop or abbot was appointed, he received 2 things. First, his spiritual authority, his ring and staff, symbols of his religious office. Second, his temporal holdings, the lands, revenues, and political authority that came with his position. The problem was that kings and emperors had been performing both of these investitures, conferring both the spiritual symbols and the temporal ones. In practice, this meant that the king was effectively appointing bishops. He would hand a candidate the ring and staff himself, as if he, a layman, had the authority to confer spiritual office. Why did kings want this power? Because bishops were enormously important political figures. A bishop controlled vast territories. He commanded the loyalty of thousands of people. He could raise money, raise men, and influence public opinion. A king who could appoint his own bishops had a massive advantage over a king who couldn't. But Gregory looked at this practice and saw something monstrous. A layman, a man not ordained, not spiritually authorized, performing a sacred ritual. Simony, the buying and selling of church offices. Corruption woven into the very fabric of church governance. He was going to end it. In 1075, Gregory issued a decree. Laymen, including kings and emperors, were forbidden from investing clergy with their spiritual offices. Any clergyman who accepted investiture from a layman would be deposed. Any layman who performed investiture would be excommunicated. The response from the secular rulers of Europe ranged from sullen resentment to outright fury. But no one was angrier than Henry IV. Henry IV, the man in the snow. Henry IV had been Holy Roman Emperor since he was 6 years old. Let that sink in. 6 years old. He was crowned in 1056, which meant that his childhood was a chaos of regencies, ambitious nobles fighting over control of his person and his empire, and constant, grinding political instability. By the time he reached adulthood and began exercising real power, Henry IV had spent his entire conscious life fighting to hold onto authority that everyone around him seemed eager to take away. He was not a bad man by the standards of his age. He was, in many ways, a capable ruler, energetic, intelligent, politically shrewd. But he was also proud. Deeply, immovably proud. And he had a genuine ideological belief that the Holy Roman Emperor was not simply a secular king. He was God's representative on earth in the temporal realm, just as the Pope was God's representative in the spiritual realm. To Henry, Gregory's decree was not just an inconvenient policy change. It was an attack on the fundamental nature of imperial authority. In early 1076, Henry made a decision that, in retrospect, looks like one of the most spectacularly reckless acts of political brinksmanship in medieval history. He called a council of German bishops at the city of Worms. And at that council, he issued a declaration. Gregory VII, he said, was no longer pope. Henry wasn't just pushing back against a decree. He was trying to depose the pope. The room must have fallen very quiet when that declaration was read aloud. Gregory's response came swiftly and with devastating precision. He excommunicated Henry IV. He declared him deposed as Holy Roman Emperor. And, crucially, he released Henry's subjects from their oaths of loyalty. Every noble in Henry's empire who had been nursing a grievance, every bishop who resented imperial interference, every prince who saw an opportunity suddenly had divine authorization to rebel. The empire did not fall apart overnight, but it cracked. Henry's support among the German princes evaporated with alarming speed. His closest allies began distancing themselves. And then came the declaration that sealed his fate, at least temporarily. The German princes announced that if Henry was still excommunicated by February 1077, they would no longer recognize him as emperor. Henry had less than a year. The walk to Canossa, 3 days in the snow. Gregory VII, aware that Henry might attempt something dramatic, had traveled to northern Italy, staying at the castle of Canossa, a fortress belonging to his ally, the Countess Matilda of Tuscany. Canossa sat in the foothills of the Apennines. In January, the mountain passes were buried in snow, the cold so severe that even armies avoided traveling through them. Henry IV crossed the Alps in January of 1077. Contemporary sources describe a journey of extraordinary physical hardship. The roads were sheets of ice. Horses had to be led on foot in places. The cold was brutal, but Henry pressed on because he had no choice. He arrived at Canossa with a small retinue, stripped of the pomp and display of imperial majesty. And then he did something that no emperor had ever done. He put on the rough wool garment of a penitent. He removed his shoes. And he stood in the snow of the outer courtyard, waiting for Gregory to receive him. Gregory made him wait. Not for an hour. Not for an afternoon. For 3 days. 3 days, Henry IV, Holy Roman Emperor, King of Germany and Italy, ruler of the most powerful political entity in Western Europe, stood barefoot in January snow, fasting and weeping, begging a pope for forgiveness. On the 3rd day, Gregory relented. He could not, theologically, refuse the sincere repentance of a penitent. To do so would have been a violation of his own spiritual authority's logic. And so he lifted the excommunication. Henry put his shoes back on and went home. Now, here is the thing that makes this moment so fascinating. Who won at Canossa? At first glance, it looks like Gregory's greatest triumph. He had brought the most powerful man in Europe to his knees. The image of Henry in the snow became one of the defining images of medieval political theology, proof that spiritual authority could humiliate temporal power. But Henry had also won. He had removed the theological justification for rebellion. The German princes, who had been waiting for his excommunication to expire so they could depose him, found themselves in an awkward position. Their excuse was gone. Henry went back to Germany, rebuilt his alliances, and eventually drove Gregory into exile. Gregory died in Salerno in 1085, reportedly saying, "I have loved righteousness and hated iniquity, therefore I die in exile." The words of a man who knew he had won the battle and lost the war. Or had he? Because what Gregory had established, what Canossa had proven, was something that could never be fully undone. An emperor had submitted to a pope. The image existed. The precedent existed. And precedents, in medieval Europe, had a way of becoming permanent. The Long War, papal power from Gregory to Innocent. The investiture controversy did not end with Canossa. It dragged on for nearly 50 years, consuming the reigns of multiple popes and multiple emperors, before reaching its formal resolution in the Concordat of Worms in 1122. The Concordat was a compromise, one of those diplomatic settlements that both sides could claim as a victory and neither side was truly satisfied with. The essential distinction it established was between spiritual investiture, which would be performed by the Church, and temporal investiture, the conferring of lands and political authority, which would be performed by secular rulers. On paper, this divided the sacred and secular neatly. In practice, it left enormous ambiguity about where one ended and the other began. And in that ambiguity, the papacy continued to grow. The 12th century was, in many ways, the golden age of papal authority. A series of extraordinarily capable popes expanded the Church's administrative reach, refined its legal apparatus, and deployed its spiritual weapons with increasing sophistication. The Crusades, launched by Pope Urban II in 1095, were perhaps the most dramatic expression of papal ambition. Urban II stood at the Council of Clermont in France and delivered a speech, the full text of which has not survived, but whose effect was immediate and transformative, calling the warriors of Christendom to take up arms and reclaim Jerusalem from Muslim rule. The response was stunning. Tens of thousands of people sewed crosses onto their garments and began marching toward the Holy Land. Not for gold, or at least not primarily for gold. Not because a king commanded them, but because a pope had told them that God willed it. An army summoned by spiritual authority, marching toward a city 3,000 miles away. Whatever you think of the Crusades, and they are enormously complex, morally troubling, and historically consequential in ways that still reverberate today, their very existence was proof of something extraordinary. The papacy could mobilize the energies of an entire civilization. No secular king had that kind of reach. The summit of papal power, Innocent III. If Gregory VII was the architect of papal supremacy, and Urban II was its great propagandist, then Innocent III was its emperor. He was born Lotario dei Conti di Segni, the son of a powerful Italian noble family. He received the finest education available in medieval Europe, studying theology in Paris and law in Bologna, the two great intellectual capitals of the 12th century world. He became pope in 1198 at the age of roughly 37. Young for a pope. Astonishingly young for the papacy's most ambitious occupant. Innocent III believed, without reservation, without qualification, without any trace of self-doubt, that the Pope was the supreme authority not just in spiritual matters but in the entire world. He used the image of the sun and the moon to illustrate his thinking. The papacy, like the sun, shines with its own divine light. Secular kingdoms, like the moon, shine only with reflected light, light that ultimately comes from the papacy. Take away the sun, and the moon goes dark. He wrote these things. He said these things. He acted on these things. During his pontificate, which lasted until 1216, Innocent III intervened in the political affairs of virtually every major kingdom in Western Europe. He arbitrated succession disputes in Germany. He placed England under interdict, an entire kingdom locked out of the sacraments, when King John refused to accept his candidate for the Archbishop of Canterbury. He organized the Fourth Crusade, which ended in the catastrophic sack of Constantinople, a Christian city, by a Christian army. He oversaw the brutal Albigensian Crusade in southern France, a campaign against heresy that became one of the most devastating conflicts of the medieval period. He convened the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, perhaps the most important church council of the medieval era, which reformed church discipline, defined doctrine on transubstantiation, and required Jews and Muslims in Christian lands to wear identifying clothing. The scope of Innocent III papacy is almost impossible to fully absorb. He was simultaneously a theologian, a lawyer, a diplomat, a military strategist, and a political operator of the highest order. And for a time it worked. Kings deferred to him. Armies marched at his command. The spiritual weapons of the papacy functioned with terrifying efficiency. But there was always a but. The seeds of decline, when overreach becomes hubris. The problem with building an empire on spiritual authority is the same problem that affects every empire built on a single resource. What happens when people stop believing in the resource? Innocent III pontificate, for all its brilliance, contained the seeds of its own undoing. Because when the papacy claimed the power to judge kings, to overthrow rulers, to launch crusades, to extract money from every corner of Christendom, it began to look less like the guardian of souls and more like a political power. And political powers invite the kind of cynical scrutiny that spiritual institutions cannot survive. The Albigensian Crusade was a particularly revealing episode. The Cathars of southern France, the heretics the crusade was launched to destroy, were not foreign invaders. They were neighbors, relatives, people who had lived and traded and intermarried with the Orthodox Catholic population for generations. The crusade against them was launched at papal insistence and prosecuted with a ferocity that shocked even some of its participants. The massacre at Béziers in 1209, where thousands of men, women, and children were reportedly killed, generated one of history's most chilling lines. When a crusader commander asked how to distinguish heretics from good Catholics, the papal legate reportedly replied, "Kill them all. God will recognize his own." Whether those exact words were spoken is disputed, but the story was told, and told, and told again, because stories like that don't fade when people want to believe them. And people begin to want to believe them when they are already growing uneasy about the institution being described. The papacy had staked its authority on moral superiority, on being the pure, uncorrupted channel of divine grace in a corrupt world. Every time a pope launched a war for political reasons and called it spiritual, every time a church office was sold to the highest bidder, every time a bishop lived in luxury while his parishioners starved, the gap between the papacy's claims and its reality widened. That gap was a crack in the foundation. And cracks, given enough time and pressure, become catastrophes. Philip IV of France, the king who fought back. The beginning of the end, or at least the beginning of the decisive reversal, came in the early 14th century, in a conflict that looks almost comically mundane compared to the theological fireworks of the investiture controversy. It started with taxes. King Philip IV of France, known to history as Philip the Fair, though his policies were anything but, needed money to fight a war with England. His solution was to tax the clergy in his kingdom. Pope Boniface VIII forbade it. Philip IV banned the export of gold from France, effectively cutting off a major source of papal revenue. Boniface backed down. That exchange, quick, brutal, utterly devoid of spiritual drama, told you everything you needed to know about how the world had changed since the days of Gregory VII. But Boniface did not learn the lesson. In 1302, he issued one of the most audacious documents in papal history, a bull called Unam Sanctum, which declared in unequivocal terms that submission to the Pope was necessary for salvation. Every human being, every king, every emperor. It was the fullest possible expression of medieval papal theory. And it was, in retrospect, the act of a man who had badly misread the room. Philip IV's response was not penitence in the snow. He sent an agent to arrest the Pope. Guillaume de Nogaret, Philip's chancellor and enforcer, traveled to Italy with a small force and, in September 1303, confronted Boniface VIII at his residence in Anagni. What happened next is disputed by the sources, but the general outline is clear. Boniface was seized, humiliated, possibly struck. The slap of Anagni is one of medieval history's most debated incidents, and held for several days before local forces freed him. Boniface VIII died a month later. Contemporary accounts suggest he died of shock and humiliation. Dante Alighieri, writing shortly afterward, placed Boniface VIII in hell. The king who brought the Vicar of Christ to grief. The Babylonian captivity. The papacy falls under French control. After Boniface's death, the papacy, weakened, humiliated, and financially dependent on French goodwill, essentially fell under French domination. In 1309, Pope Clement V moved the papal court from Rome to Avignon, a city in southern France. And there it stayed for nearly 70 years. The Avignon papacy, called the Babylonian captivity of the Church by its critics, a reference to the Hebrew Bible story of the Israelites held captive in Babylon, was not a period of overt French control. The popes at Avignon were not French puppets in any simple sense. They were genuine spiritual leaders who continued to administer the Church with considerable sophistication. But the symbolism was devastating. Rome, the city of Peter and Paul, the eternal city, the throne of the apostles, sat empty of its bishop. The Pope lived in a comfortable French palace, surrounded by French cardinals, operating within the French political orbit. Every medieval observer understood what this meant. The spiritual independence of the papacy, its claim to stand above all nations and all kings, was visibly, tangibly compromised. The theologians who had argued for papal supremacy on the grounds that the Pope answered to God alone now had to explain why the Pope seemed to answer to the King of France. They couldn't explain it. Not satisfactorily. And the people of Europe noticed. The Great Schism, when there were 3 popes. In 1377, Pope Gregory XI made the decision to return the papacy to Rome. It was a bold act of institutional self-rescue, and it came too late. Gregory XI died in 1378, and the election of his successor descended into chaos. The Roman population, desperate to keep the papacy in Rome, essentially rioted and intimidated the cardinals into electing an Italian. Urban VI was chosen, and immediately revealed himself to be erratic, abusive, and possibly mentally unstable. He berated cardinals in public, threatened them physically, and alienated virtually everyone around him. The French cardinals withdrew from Rome, declared Urban VI's election invalid on the grounds that it had been made under duress, and elected their own pope. Clement VII took up residence in Avignon. There were now 2 popes. Both excommunicated the other. Both claimed the full authority of the papacy. Both appointed cardinals, issued decrees, collected revenues, and demanded the loyalty of Christendom. The people of Europe were forced to choose. France, Scotland, and the Iberian kingdoms recognized Avignon. England, the Holy Roman Empire, and most of Italy recognized Rome. The Great Schism lasted for nearly 40 years. 40 years of 2, and eventually 3, simultaneous claimants to the papal throne. 40 years of competing excommunications, competing decrees, competing claims to the keys of Peter. The damage to papal authority was incalculable, because the entire logic of papal supremacy rested on the idea that there was one pope, one vicar of Christ, one channel of divine authority on earth. The moment there were 2 or 3, the entire structure was exposed as a human construction, a political arrangement, something that could break apart under the pressure of human ambition and institutional failure, something, perhaps, that had always been more fragile than anyone wanted to admit. The conciliarists, challenging the throne of Peter. The Great Schism produced, among many other things, a genuine intellectual revolution. If the Pope was supreme, and there were now 3 popes, what did supremacy mean? If following one pope meant being excommunicated by the other 2, how could any faithful Christian navigate their spiritual life? Necessity, as always, became the mother of invention. A group of theologians and canon lawyers began articulating a new theory of church governance, one that would have been considered dangerously radical a century earlier. They argued that supreme authority in the church resided not in the Pope alone, but in a general council, an assembly of bishops representing the whole church. This was conciliarism, and in the early 15th century, it had its moment of apparent triumph. The Council of Constance, meeting between 1414 and 1418, accomplished something extraordinary. It ended the Great Schism by deposing all 3 claimants. Yes, deposing a pope, something that the conciliarists argued the council had the authority to do, and electing a new, single pope, Martin V. It also burned Jan Hus at the stake. Hus was a Bohemian theologian who had been preaching church reform, attacking clerical corruption, questioning papal authority, demanding that the laity receive communion in both kinds, bread and wine, rather than bread alone, which was standard Catholic practice. He had been given a safe conduct to appear before the council and explain his views. The safe conduct was voided. He was condemned, and on July 6, 1415, he was burned as a heretic. His last words at the stake were reportedly, "What I taught with my lips, I now seal with my blood." His execution did not end his movement. It created martyrs. It transformed a theological dispute into a national and ethnic cause in Bohemia. The Hussite wars that followed would consume Bohemia for decades. And the ideas Huss died for, about the corruption of the church, about the authority of scripture over papal decree, about the right of ordinary Christians to participate more fully in the life of faith, did not die with him. They went underground. They spread. They waited. The Ottoman shadow and the fall of Constantinople. While the Western Church struggled with its internal crises, a geopolitical catastrophe was unfolding in the East that would reshape the Christian world and, paradoxically, both deepen and further undermine papal authority. The Ottoman Empire had been expanding steadily for over a century. One by one, the territories that had once formed the Byzantine Empire, the Greek-speaking Christian civilization that had maintained the traditions of Rome in the East, fell under Ottoman control. By the mid-15th century, Constantinople itself, the city of Constantine, the Second Rome, the jewel of Eastern Christendom, was surrounded. On May 29, 1453, Sultan Mehmed II led his forces through the walls of Constantinople. The Byzantine Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos died in the fighting, or so tradition holds. His body was never definitively identified. The Great Hagia Sophia, built by Justinian nearly 1,000 years earlier and one of the architectural wonders of the world, was converted into a mosque within hours of the conquest. The news reached Western Europe with the force of a physical blow. For centuries, Western Christians had understood Constantinople as a bulwark, the great city that stood between Christian civilization and the threats of the East. The Crusades had been launched partly with Constantinople's safety in mind. However, much crusading politics complicated that picture. Now it was gone. Pope Nicholas V called for a new crusade. The response was muted. The princes of Western Europe were too busy fighting each other, too suspicious of each other's motives, too financially exhausted by decades of internal conflict. The contrast with Urban II's crusade call of 1095, when tens of thousands had taken the cross and marched toward the Holy Land, was stark. The papacy could no longer mobilize Christendom. Whether Christendom, as a unified spiritual and political community, still truly existed was becoming an open question. The Renaissance popes, when spiritual authority met secular ambition. The 15th century produced a series of popes who embodied, in their persons and their pontificates, the deepest contradictions of the medieval church. These were the Renaissance popes, men of genuine culture, education, and sophistication, who lived and thought and acted like Italian Renaissance princes as much as spiritual leaders. Men who commissioned the greatest art of their age, rebuilt Rome into a city of marble and magnificence, patronized Michelangelo and Raphael and Bramante, and also kept mistresses, fathered children, bought and sold church offices, and waged wars for Italian territorial advantage. Alexander VI, born Rodrigo Borgia, Pope from 1492 to 1503, fathered at least 4 illegitimate children, including the notorious Cesare and Lucrezia Borgia. He used the papacy as a political tool for Borgia family aggrandizement with a brazenness that shocked even contemporaries who were not easily shocked. Julius II, Pope from 1503 to 1513, was so fond of personally leading military campaigns that he was nicknamed the Papa Terribile, the terrifying pope. He is perhaps most famous today as the man who commissioned Michelangelo to paint the Sistine Chapel ceiling. But he is also the man who commissioned it while simultaneously besieging cities and wearing armor over his papal vestments. The art these men produced was genuinely magnificent. The Sistine Chapel, St. Peter's Basilica, the Vatican Museums. These are gifts to human civilization that survive and awe us to this day. But they came at a price. To build St. Peter's Basilica, one of the largest and most expensive construction projects in human history, the papacy under Leo X authorized an enormous expansion of the sale of indulgences. An indulgence was, in theological theory, a remission of the temporal punishment due to sin, a reduction of time in purgatory, effectively. In practice, by the early 16th century, indulgences had become a straightforward financial transaction. You paid money. You received a document. Your sins, or your deceased relative's sins, were in some sense reduced. The man most responsible for selling these indulgences in Germany was a Dominican friar named Johann Tetzel, who reportedly traveled from town to town with a memorable pitch: "As soon as the coin in the coffer rings, a soul from purgatory springs." A German theology professor in the university town of Wittenberg found this enraging. His name was Martin Luther. The hammer on the door, Martin Luther and the Reformation. On October 31, 1517, Martin Luther reportedly nailed a document to the door of the castle church in Wittenberg. Whether he actually nailed it, whether the famous image of the hammer striking the door is historical fact or later legend, is a matter historians still debate. What is not debated is that Luther published his 95 Theses, a list of arguments against indulgences and the theology that justified them. Luther was not, initially, a revolutionary. He was a professor of theology doing what professors of theology did, proposing arguments for academic debate. He wrote in Latin, the language of scholars. He sent copies to his bishop and to the Archbishop of Mainz, the senior church official in Germany. He expected a scholarly response. What he got was something no one had anticipated: the printing press. Gutenberg's invention was less than a century old in 1517, but it had already transformed the circulation of information in Europe in ways that the Church had not fully processed. Luther's theses were translated into German and printed in editions that spread across Germany within weeks. People who could barely read had them read aloud to them in taverns and market squares. Scholars debated them in universities. Nobles who had long resented paying money to Rome found in them an intellectual framework for their resentments. The Church's initial response was to try to silence Luther, to do what it had done with every previous critic, every previous reformer, every previous Jan Hus. But this was not the world of 1415. This was the world of the printing press. You could burn one man. You could not burn 10,000 printed pamphlets. You could not unread an argument that had already been read by half of Germany. The Church summoned Luther to recant. He refused. He was excommunicated in 1521. At the Diet of Worms, a formal imperial assembly where Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, gave Luther one final chance to recant, Luther said something that had never really been said in quite this way before. When asked if he would withdraw his teachings, he reportedly answered, "Unless I am convinced by the testimony of the Scriptures or by clear reason, for I do not trust either in the Pope or in councils alone, since it is well known that they have often erred and contradicted themselves, I am bound by the Scriptures I have quoted, and my conscience is captive to the Word of God. I cannot and will not recant anything, since it is neither safe nor right to go against conscience. Here I stand. I can do no other." Whatever words he actually spoke on that day, the exact quote is disputed. The defiance was real. And it was a defiance that the Church, for all its centuries of spiritual weaponry, could not extinguish. Luther returned to Wittenberg under the protection of Frederick the Wise of Saxony and began translating the Bible into German, into the language of ordinary people, stripping away the clerical monopoly on scriptural interpretation that had been one of the foundations of ecclesiastical authority. The Reformation had begun. The fracturing of Christendom. What came after Luther? Luther did not intend to create Lutheranism. He intended to reform Catholicism. But the forces he unleashed, the questioning of papal authority, the insistence on scripture over tradition, the democratization of religious interpretation enabled by the printing press, could not be directed or contained. Within a generation, Western Christendom had fractured into dozens of competing confessions. Lutherans in Germany and Scandinavia, Calvinists in Switzerland, France, the Netherlands, and Scotland, Zwinglians, Anabaptists, Anglicans in England, where Henry VIII's matrimonial ambitions had given him a personal incentive to break with Rome. Each of these movements had its own theology, its own practices, its own understanding of Scripture and salvation. They argued with each other as bitterly as they argued with Rome. They persecuted each other, sometimes with as much ferocity as the Inquisition had used against heretics. The unity of Western Christendom, that grand medieval ideal, the society of all baptized Christians under one spiritual authority, was gone. The wars of religion that followed were among the most devastating conflicts in European history. The French Wars of Religion, the Dutch Revolt, the 30 Years' War, which began in 1618 and ended only in 1648 with the Peace of Westphalia, a settlement that, among other things, essentially accepted the permanent division of Christianity and established the principle that rulers could determine the religion of their territories. The 30 Years' War killed, by some estimates, a third of the population of the Holy Roman Empire. Towns burned, crops failed, plague followed armies across a shattered landscape. And when it was over, when the smoke cleared and the diplomats gathered at Westphalia to draw the new map of Europe, one thing was strikingly absent from the negotiations: the Pope. The papacy had not been invited to the peace table. The settlement that ended the most destructive war in European history to that point was made without consulting the Vicar of Christ. Innocent III, who had arbitrated the succession disputes of emperors and placed kingdoms under interdict, would not have believed it possible. The Enlightenment and the Age of Reason, the final blow. The 17th and 18th centuries brought a different kind of challenge to papal authority, not the raw political conflicts of the medieval era, not the religious ferment of the Reformation, but something quieter and, in some ways, more fundamentally corrosive. The Enlightenment. The great thinkers of the 17th and 18th centuries, Descartes, Locke, Voltaire, Hume, Rousseau, Kant, were engaged in a systematic project of grounding knowledge, morality, and political authority in reason rather than revelation. Not the authority of Scripture. Not the authority of the Church. Not the authority of tradition passed down through apostolic succession. Human reason. The capacity of the individual mind to examine evidence, construct arguments, and arrive at truth independently of any external spiritual authority. This was a challenge the papacy had no good answer to. The medieval church had been able to absorb the intellectual challenges of Aristotle, had engaged with Islamic philosophy, had built the great cathedral schools and universities precisely because it believed that reason and faith were compatible, that truth was one, and that reason, properly guided, would always arrive at the same conclusions as revelation. But the Enlightenment made a different argument. Not that reason was compatible with faith, but that reason was sufficient without faith. That you could build ethics, politics, and knowledge without any reference to God, Pope, Scripture, or Church. Voltaire's attacks on the Church, collected in a devastating body of satire and polemic, did not take the form of theological argument. They took the form of mockery, of ridicule, of the devastating observation that the institution claiming to represent the God of love had, over the centuries, burned, tortured, and massacred with remarkable enthusiasm. Écrasez l'infâme, Voltaire reportedly said, "Crush the infamous thing." He meant the Church. And while Voltaire was not crushing anything literally, he was participating in a transformation of educated European opinion that was, in its way, more thorough than anything Luther had achieved. Luther had replaced one form of Christian authority with another. The Enlightenment was questioning whether Christianity needed external institutional authority at all. The French Revolution, the world the Church built, unmade. The ideas of the Enlightenment became action in 1789. The French Revolution did not begin as an anti-Catholic movement. The early revolutionary documents, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, spoke of universal rights and did not specifically target religion. But the logic of revolution, driven by financial crisis and popular fury at the entire structure of the Ancien Regime, inevitably came for the Church. The Church in France was one of the largest landowners in the country, holding perhaps 10% of all French territory and paying no taxes on it. In a country on the verge of bankruptcy, this was intolerable. In November 1789, the National Assembly voted to nationalize church property. In 1790, the civil constitution of the clergy reorganized the French Church as an arm of the state, requiring clergy to swear loyalty to the revolutionary government rather than to Rome. In 1793, during the most radical phase of the revolution, the government launched the de-Christianization campaign, converting churches into temples of reason, replacing the Christian calendar with a revolutionary one, eliminating religious holidays, and attempting, in the most literal possible sense, to remove Christianity from French public life. Priests were executed. Nuns were forced to renounce their vows. Church bells were melted down for canon. Thousands of clergy were killed or exiled. Pope Pius VI watched in horror. He issued condemnations. He denounced the revolution. The revolutionary government's response was to invade the Papal States. In 1798, French forces marched into Rome. The Pope was arrested and taken to France as a prisoner, where he died in captivity in 1799. The Pope died in prison, in a foreign country, while a revolutionary government converted Rome's churches into warehouses. Gregory VII would not have believed it. Innocent III would not have believed it. The world they had built, the world where popes humiliated emperors, where spiritual authority claimed dominion over all earthly power, had been, in the space of a decade, turned inside out. Napoleon and the Church, a new bargain. History, as it always does, moved in unexpected directions. Napoleon Bonaparte, who understood the practical value of institutional religion with the cold eye of a political engineer, made a deal with the papacy in 1801, the Concordat of 1801. The Church got recognition. Napoleon got the Church's blessing and its administrative cooperation. The nationalized church property stayed nationalized. The Pope accepted the new order in exchange for being, once again, acknowledged as the spiritual leader of French Catholics. And then, in 1804, Napoleon did something that echoed across the centuries. He summoned Pope Pius VII to Paris for his coronation as Emperor of the French. The Pope made the journey. He sat in Notre Dame Cathedral on December 2, 1804, surrounded by the pageantry of the new French Empire. And then Napoleon took the imperial crown and placed it on his own head. Not waiting for the Pope to do it. Not asking for the Pope's blessing to complete his authority. Simply taking the crown as if to demonstrate, in the most theatrical way possible, that his power came from himself and from the people of France, not from any spiritual intermediary. Pius VII sat in his throne and watched. The echo of Charlemagne's coronation 1,000 years earlier, when the Pope had placed the crown on the emperor's head, when that single gesture had contained such enormous symbolic weight, must have been impossible to miss. The difference was the point. The loss of temporal power. The papacy becomes itself again. The 19th century brought the final humiliation, and, in a strange way, the final liberation of the papacy's temporal power. The Papal States, the territories in central Italy that the papacy had ruled as a secular power since the 8th century, had been the material foundation of papal independence. If the Pope owned land and commanded soldiers, he could not be easily bullied by secular rulers into submission. But the 19th century was the century of nationalism. Italy, long divided into small states and foreign-occupied territories, was being unified under the House of Savoy by the brilliant and ruthless statesman Camillo di Cavour and the romantic revolutionary Giuseppe Garibaldi. The Papal States stood in the way of Italian unification. In 1870, with French troops, who had been protecting Rome, withdrawn because of the Franco-Prussian War, Italian forces entered the city. The Pope, Pius IX, withdrew to the Vatican and declared himself a prisoner. He refused to recognize the new Italian state. He ordered Catholics not to participate in Italian politics. For nearly 60 years, the popes lived in this state of theatrical protest, prisoners of the Vatican, ruling the tiny enclave of St. Peter's Square and the Vatican Palace while the secular world moved on around them. The final resolution came only in 1929, with the Lateran Treaty between Mussolini's government and Pius XI. The papacy formally renounced its claim to the Papal States and accepted the creation of Vatican City, 44 hectares of sovereign territory, as the papal domain. In exchange, the Catholic Church received recognition, financial compensation, and a concordat that gave it significant privileges in Italian public life. The 1,000-year experiment in papal temporal power was formally over. The Pope was now, as he had been in the very beginning, before Constantine, before Charlemagne, before the great medieval drama of spiritual versus secular authority, Simply a bishop. A bishop of extraordinary symbolic importance, of vast institutional reach, of enormous moral influence. But no longer a territorial ruler. No longer a power that could make emperors stand in snow. The legacy, what did it all mean? We have traveled more than 1,500 years. From the collapse of Rome to the signing of the Lateran Treaty. From Gregory VII confrontation with Henry IV to Napoleon placing his own crown on his own head. What does this story mean? What echoes does it leave in our world? The first echo is institutional. The medieval church built the administrative, legal, and educational infrastructure that shaped Western civilization in ways so fundamental we often don't see them. The university system, begun in the 12th century under church auspices, is still with us. Natural law theory, which undergirds much of modern human rights discourse, has deep roots in medieval scholastic theology. Canon law, the church's legal system, contributed significantly to the development of Western legal traditions. When we talk about the separation of church and state as a foundational principle of liberal democracy, we are partly reacting to the medieval entanglement between spiritual and secular authority, but we are also, paradoxically, building on the medieval church's own insistence that there are two realms of authority that must be distinguished. The second echo is political. The conflict between spiritual authority and temporal power never fully resolved. It transformed. In secular modernity, we still argue about the boundaries between moral authority and political power. About whether institutions with moral claims, religious organizations, international bodies, human rights organizations, have the right to constrain or judge political authorities. About whether there are universal moral standards that transcend national sovereignty. These are not medieval questions that have been answered. They are medieval questions that have changed their vocabulary. The third echo is the cautionary tale of overreach. Every institution in this story, the papacy, the Holy Roman Empire, the French monarchy, the revolutionary government, destroyed itself, at least in part, by claiming more authority than any human institution can sustainably hold. Gregory VII's vision of total spiritual supremacy generated the very resistance that ultimately broke it. Napoleon's empire collapsed partly under the weight of its own ambitions. The French Revolution's attempt to replace Christianity with reason created a terror that destroyed the revolution itself. There is something almost mathematically consistent about this pattern. The higher an institution claims to stand, the further it falls. The fourth echo is perhaps the most human one. At the center of this entire story, beneath all the theology, the politics, the military campaigns, the legal arguments, is a simple, universal human question. Who has the right to tell me what to do? The medieval papacy's answer was, we do, because we speak for God. The Reformation's answer was, no one, except Scripture and conscience. The Enlightenment's answer was, no one, except reason. The modern democratic answer is, the people, through legitimate institutions, constrained by rights. These answers are different, but the question is the same, and it is a question that does not go away. It simply finds new forms in every generation, which is perhaps the most important legacy of the one power that toppled emperors faster than any army. Not its triumphs, not even its failures, but the question it forced humanity to keep asking, who ultimately has authority over me? And the long, painful, magnificent, still unfinished process of trying to find a worthy answer. From Henry IV weeping in the January snow at Canossa, to Napoleon placing his own crown on his own head in Notre Dame, to a pope signing a treaty that traded 1,000 years of temporal power for 44 hectares of sovereign ground. This is the story of an institution that remade the world. Not through armies, though it commanded them. Not through gold, though it collected it. Not through fear, though it inspired it. But through the one force that has always moved human beings more completely than any sword. The conviction that something greater than any king, any empire, any army, is watching and judging and cares. That conviction built cathedrals. It launched crusades. It humiliated emperors and crowned others. It burned heretics and sheltered scholars. It produced the Sistine Chapel and the Inquisition, the University of Paris and the massacre at Béziers. Thomas Aquinas and Rodrigo Borgia. It was the most human of institutions wearing the clothing of the divine. And the story of its rise and fall is, in the end, the story of Western civilization trying, imperfectly, sometimes violently, always passionately, to answer the oldest question in politics. Who rules? The echoes of that question still shape every corner of the world we live in. Every debate about religious freedom, every conflict between conscience and law, every argument about the limits of political authority, these are the grandchildren of Gregory VII and Henry IV standing across from each other in the winter of 1076. And perhaps that is the truest measure of a historical event's importance. Not whether we remember it, but whether we are still, in ways we barely recognize, living inside it. If this journey through one of history's greatest power struggles moved you, if you want to keep exploring the forgotten chapters that shaped our world, subscribe. Hit the bell. Leave a comment telling me which moment in this story surprised you most. Was it Henry in the snow? Napoleon and the crown? The three popes? Let's keep the conversation going. History is never over. It's just waiting to be found.